Well, good morning, everybody. And welcome to our special grand rounds. I'm just going to deal with an echo here. This is a very special grand rounds for two reasons. The first is the fact that we are doing a hybrid event. This event is coming to you live from Sumner Auditorium, observing IPAC regulations. We have a cadre of Team LHSC here, and we are streaming out to the world. And indeed, one of our speakers will be joining us virtually as well. So we are blending those two worlds. It's also important because this is a very special CEO Grand Rounds addressing Islamophobia and honoring our London family, which if you have been in London over the weekend is one of the moments that our city has come together to honor the family, to recognize the horrific events that took place last year, and to begin to craft an action plan forward. So I'm not going to do much more except to introduce myself. My name is Paul McIver. I'm the Communications and Public Engagement Executive here at LHSC, and I'm joined by a wonderful group of panelists. And I'll begin by introducing our CEO and President, Dr. Jackie Schleifer-Taylor.
Thank you, Paul, and thank you to everyone for joining us today. It's been 1 year since the terrorist attack that took the lives of 4 members of Afzal family while seriously injuring another, an attack that was undoubtedly motivated by Islamophobia. It's only appropriate that we begin this event with a moment of silence for the Afzal family. Hate and discrimination are such ugly realities in our society. We may at times like to pretend that they don't exist, but they do. Many of us encounter them every day. For some, it's the color of their skin. For some, their sexual orientation or gender identity, and for others, their faith. Islamophobia exists and it's pervasive. Here in Canada, here in London, and yes, in healthcare. We must all do our part in addressing Islamophobia and other forms of hate, and I believe that begins with learning. Earlier this year, I put out a call to every member of Team LHSC for ideas on how we would mark this anniversary to honor the Afzal family while addressing Islamophobia. We received many ideas showing the compassion and commitment of our people. A small working group was formed to take these ideas and action them. I would be remiss if I didn't take this opportunity to thank those who contributed their time to that very important work. Faisal Khan, in the audience with us today, Dr. Mohammed Al-Fakani, also in the audience today, Dr. Wael Hadera, with us at Victoria Hospital today, and Paul McIver, who you just met. The result of that work is today's event, an opportunity to come together, to hear from experts on the topic of Islamophobia, its history, and how we can work collectively, all of us, to address it. This event is one of many happening in our community this week, and it contributes to a larger conversation. While this event is primarily focused on Team LHSC, we've invited a few of our local healthcare partners and members of the media to come in. We will also be sharing a recording on our public channels afterwards, recognizing the importance of bringing light to this conversation. We decided to bring this event together under the CEO Grand Rounds umbrella because CEO Grand Rounds are focused on learning. They're about igniting innovative collaborative approaches to healthcare, and that includes approaches to health equity, inclusion, and social accountability. The learning objectives for today's session are to identify the characteristics of Islamophobia and its origins, recognize Islamophobia in the workplace and beyond, describe actions that can be taken to address Islamophobia, oppose hate, and make LHSC an inclusive space, and apply these actions in your work and life. That is our call today. Now, before I introduce our first speaker, I want to introduce someone who was gracious enough to take time out of his very busy schedule to join us today. Please welcome Mayor Ed Holder.
Dr. Schleifer-Taylor, thank you very much for those thoughtful comments. And how could I not be here today, of all days? I'd like to begin by talking about LHSC in terms of what the staff, both frontline, backline, administration, doctors, nurses, interns, orderlies, everyone, what you all mean to our London community. What you all do is so much beyond words that I could express thoughtfully. But I've always ever been consistent to say how much you mean to our city, to this region, to our province, to this country, to me. You know, it's rather interesting. LHSC is one of the largest employers in the country in terms of hospitals, but you're the largest employer in London, Ontario. Makes a great statement when we can manage, you know, it's funny, City Hall is not a small group, but I always say it's kind of like herding cats or putting Jello to a wall and seeing how it can all work together, but you make it all work together. You make it all work together because of the passion of how you feel about the work that you do. And you do it every day. And you've done it every day during a pandemic, lest we forget. That's been extraordinary. And I cannot tell you how grateful our community, this city, I am for all that you do every day. Because when they say half of life is showing up, well, not only do you show up, but you're extraordinary in the work that you do and you honor all of us. So what else can I say around that except heartfelt thanks from us to you? So it is a very unique day today. And it's important that I pay respects to the Afsal family on this difficult anniversary. It's been 1 year since that hate-fueled act of terror that took the lives of 4 members of our community, 4 members of our Muslim community, 4 members of our London family. June 6, 2021 will be forever remembered in London and across the country. And I recall back in those days when I would get communications from mayors and premiers and the prime minister and consuls general and people from around the world and ordinary citizens that just felt so deeply about what happened in our community on a night when 4 people, 4 family members, 3 generations, were just taking a walk. And we all know the disaster that happened as a result because of the acute impact it's had on all of us. Ours cannot be a community, though, where Londoners look the other way and pretend not to hear, or to keep themselves and to themselves while hatred goes unchecked. Instead, it must be one where in the days that followed, where thousands of us, people of all ages, of all backgrounds, walked our streets together in support of the Afsal family and in support of our community, where strangers comforted strangers at the site of the attack, and where children, little ones, wrote messages in chalk with the promise and hope of a brighter future. That's very powerful. That is the London I know. So my challenge to all Londoners is that we do not rely solely on government to make things right. And we do not allow our progress to be measured only on the anniversary of what is our city's darkest hour. Rather, our progress must be measured daily and on a moment-to-moment basis. And it demands sacrifice and commitment, individually and collectively. That commitment may come in the form of time. You know, my Cape Breton mom said we have 3 gifts: time, talent, and treasure. But the greatest of these is time. Time spent learning, time spent understanding more about each other. And it may require some sacrifice of comfort by challenging an ignorant remark at a dinner table or a group text or in any other place in the community. You know, you've all heard that expression, when you see something, say something. We have an obligation to say something. If we want to root out hatred, racism, oppression, we do it at the personal level. And while we at government can do certain things, I would submit to you, much of it is symbolic, and I really do understand why symbols matter. But unless we all take that individual responsibility to matter, to make a difference in the lives of each other, once we do that, then we know that we have made the kind of progress that Londoners and Canadians deserve. So let me take a moment now, if I can, to recognize that this hospital is a pillar in our community. And what you do is so essential in responding to crises like the one we have been dealing with, the Afsal family, where they were treated by this hospital. And the pandemic, where you have sacrificed so much. I know your role is difficult. I truly do. And it often leaves a mark. But I need to say thank you for caring for Londoners in the most sincere way possible, even in the most difficult of circumstances. And thank you for taking this time to have this important conversation as we honor our London family. You know, as I've thought about today and leading up today, I thought of some of the challenges that we as any community have. You know, this terrorist attack to me is irrefutable proof that Islamophobia is a problem in our society. You know what we used to say? Never in London. Not in London. It might happen somewhere else, never here. Well, we're part of a very ugly club, and no one is immune. And not government legislation, and sadly, sometimes not even individual acts will prevent this very horrible act of racist, terrorist hatred. It's an issue certainly that affects Muslims every day in all aspects of their life, including healthcare. And everyone should feel welcome in our hospitals. And LHSC, with its great role as our largest employer, but also as a role model in our city. I think you do so many things exceptionally well. And for the record, I'm a huge fan of what you all do, if that's not obvious. Your work to oppose hate and build inclusive environments is essential to the message that we're trying to deliver. The CEO Grand Rounds is totally evidence of that. And I think that's so crucial to maintain these conversations. And that's why today is so critical, for the educational opportunity that it provides and the chance to create change together. So thanks for letting me be part of the conversation today. I know you have some great speakers coming up, Haroon, Siddiqui, and Ingrid Matson. Looking forward to their participation on this critically important topic. And if I started by thanking Dr. Jackie Schleifer-Taylor for the introduction, I want to say thank you again for the opportunity to allow me, as representative of our London City Council, to be part of this very important discussion. Thanks for committing to equity. Thank you for committing to inclusion. And thank you to you and to all members of the LHSC family for belonging and making a difference in this great city of ours. God bless you all. Thank you.
Thank you, Mayor Holder. It was obvious we would wish your inclusion. Thank you so much for the candor of your words and how you represent the community so genuinely every time. We're grateful for you. Thank you. I now have the honor of introducing our first speaker today, and that is Haroon Siddiqui. Haroon is editorial page editor emeritus and a former columnist for the Toronto Star, Canada's largest newspaper. Since 2002, he has been a senior fellow at Massey College, University of Toronto. He is the author of a best-selling book, Being Muslim, on the impact of 9/11 on Muslims around the world. He has covered or supervised the coverage of Canada since 1968 under 9 prime ministers. He has also reported from 50 countries, including Afghanistan, Iran, and much of the Middle East. He is a member of the Order of Ontario as well as the Order of Canada, and today he joins us virtually for this important discussion. Please join me in welcoming Haroon. Haroon, my apologies. I think you are still muted.
There you are. It just proves how inept I am. Can you hear me now?
Is it unmuted? Okay, we're having a little technical difficulty.
Can you hear me now?
24 plus months into the pandemic.
Can you hear me now?
I'm gonna chalk it up to the emotions of the moment too.
Can you hear me? Yeah, that's good. Sorry, my apologies. I'm technically totally inept. I just want to thank Mayor Holder, Dr. Schleifer-Taylor, and all the organizers, including Robert DeLate and Gana Singh, for this commemoration that you have arranged for the Afzal family. Yesterday, there was an occasion in London where people gathered, and today there's a vigil in Hyde Park, where a friend of the murdered Yumna was to read out a letter. It's in the newspaper today, and says, and this is written by a friend of Yumna by the name of Mariam, and it says, "It's real that you're dead. You're dead because you are a Muslim." And there's, in the same story that I read in the Star today, it quotes an Afzal family neighbor, Sama Yasir, as asking the following: where can we walk? Where can we not walk in London? I mean, this question is being asked in our beloved Canada. So it is appropriate that you are commemorating as well, because besides your center's involvement on that tragic day, fact is Salman Afzal was a psychotherapist, a member of the health giving family of London, and he helped people in care homes. Just by way of background that some of us know, some of us forget, is that the London murders followed the mass murder in January 2017 at the Quebec City Mosque, in which 6 people were murdered within 2 minutes and 19 were left injured. That was the biggest massacre in Canada since the 1989 shooting at Montreal's École Polytechnique, where we remember that 14 women were gunned down and 14 were left injured. In 2020, a volunteer at a mosque in Etobicoke, not far from where I live, was stabbed to death because he was a Muslim. What is generally not known that 6 months after the Quebec City massacre, the Muslims in Quebec City wanted to create a burial ground for Muslims so they don't have to drive their dead from Quebec City to Montreal, a 3-hour drive. So they bought a plot of land in a private cemetery just outside Quebec City. And the project needed a zoning change, which then in turn necessitated a referendum. And in that referendum, the voters of that municipality rejected the idea of a Muslim section in a cemetery. So they didn't even want dead Muslims among themselves. This is in Canada, the only official nation in the whole world that has official multiculturalism. You know, it used to be that besides the cultural genocide that was committed on our Aboriginal peoples of this land, it was always historically true that Canadians tended to look down on newcomers and immigrants and treat them badly. And our history is full of those. Chinese, Japanese, Sikhs, Blacks, Jews, Catholics, especially those from Ireland and Italy, were badly treated at the lowest rung of the ladder. My friend Irving Abella, the former president of the Canadian Jewish Congress, had this line in a book. He used to say jokingly that Canada is a nation of immigrants that hates immigrants. And then Senator Ratna Omidwar, who is from Toronto, rephrased it this way: Canada wants immigration, but it does not want immigrants. But slowly we have changed. Slowly multiculturalism changed, the Charter of Rights changed us and our attitudes to each other, our pluralism, with the result that now Canada is the only nation in the Western world, only nation in the entire Western world that has a national consensus on the need for immigration and on the need for immigrants and the need to integrate them and live peacefully with each other. And if you ask Canadians generally, not just immigrants, if you ask Canadians, what is your number one sort of choice of what you like about Canada? The number one thing that appears is not hockey, it's not going to the cottages, but it is the Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedoms, especially Section 27 of the Charter. This is extraordinary that we are the only people in the world who cite their constitution and the charter as a number one thing that they like. This speaks to what has happened to Canada in the last 50 years or so, much for the better. Except we have this Islamophobia, which has sprung up from 9/11. And 9/11, when 19 Muslim terrorists killed nearly 3,000 innocent Americans. And since then, the world has been turned upside down. Since then, a war on terror was launched on Afghanistan, Iraq, and 70 other nations, covertly or overtly. And 1 million Muslims have been killed since then. This is according to Brown University survey. And 37 million Muslims around the world have been displaced. So if you wage wars like that, in fact, that was the biggest war in history waged by the United States and anybody else, longer than the First World War, longer than the Second World War, longer than the Vietnam War, longer than all combined. And wars need propaganda. Wars need propaganda at home to keep the consensus, to keep the wars going. $2 trillion have been spent on those wars so far, distorting public priorities as to where to spend on healthcare, on looking after the needy in Canada and the United States and Britain. But warmongering has cost $2 trillion and distorted all our priorities. And along with this massive propaganda that has distorted us and our thinking and how we approach each other. Wars need outright lies, such as the presence of WMD, if you remember, in Iraq, which were never found. It also requires soft lies, like we are in Afghanistan to liberate Afghan women from the clutches of the Taliban. Afghan women need liberating, all right, but we did not invade Afghanistan to liberate them. It was said that the war on terror was to be waged on Muslim terrorists, not Muslims, let alone on Islam. But it is not easy to separate the bad Muslims there and the good Muslims here. So they overlap. So what happened immediately, it did not take long after 9/11 to say, to lay collective guilt on all Muslims here, especially the 30 million Muslim who live as minorities in the Western world, in the United States, Canada, Europe, and Australia. And it used to be a standard question on a day when some terrorist attack took place anywhere. I'm driving to work, and I would know exactly what would be in my mail inbox when I get to the office. What do you, Mr. Siddiqui, have to say about this? So I am responsible for what happened in Beslan or Cambodia or wherever. This is the kind of laying of collective guilt that we did, much to our shame, on Japanese Canadians in the Second World War. Muslim Canadians were not interned like the Japanese Canadians, but we were psychologically interned and hounded by just about everybody, including shamefully the mainstream media, my colleagues in my profession. And then it follows also that if we are in Afghanistan and Iraq, and we are going to save the Muslim women there, we need to save Muslim women here as well. Because if Muslims there are misogynistic, they must be misogynist here as well. Therefore, ban on the hijab. Therefore, Quebec's Charter of Quebec values. Therefore, now Bill 21 in Quebec. Therefore, Mr. Harper's Barbaric Cultural Practices Act, outlawing things that were already outlawed. Because why is this happening? Because there's a kind of deliberate propaganda waged by the Pentagon, by the war machines, by war contractors, and by those whose geopolitical interests were served by keeping this war going. That included Muslim dictators in the Middle East and so on, who are afraid of democracy and whose interest it is to have the specter of Muslim terrorism and keep getting money from the United States and keep this hysteria going. And that was not the end of it. That led to a cultural warfare in Canada, in Europe, and in the United States. Therefore, the hysteria about Sharia is coming, you know. Half the American states took legislative or administrative steps to ban the Sharia that was not coming. How possibly could the Sharia have come? What would have happened? I mean, the United States of America would have set aside its constitution and imposed the Sharia law in Texas and every place else. We had our own share of hysteria in Ontario. I mean, how would it have happened? We would have set aside the criminal code and said, as of tomorrow morning, Sharia is coming. But we were just totally mad. And it turned out that this was a deliberate ploy by a whole team of people in the United States who waged this war, saying, we did it just to raise a ruckus about Muslims. I mean, this is on record. This fellow in New York, he said he just came up with this idea and started the petition, and we kept going. So we have this incongruity of even losing reasoning and logic. Just think about this. The Ayatollahs in Iran, the Taliban in Afghanistan and elsewhere tell Muslim women what they should wear. And now we have the incongruity of secularists and feminists and so on telling Muslim women what not to wear. And if you wear a hijab, we are going to fire you from the jobs that give you the independence from your menfolk and send you back to home. It's illogical what we have been doing. All of this really leads to the point that Islamophobia is just the flip side of anti-Semitism. In 2006, I was at a conference in Berlin and I ran into Uri Avneri, the great Nobel laureate and peace activist in Israel. And I was asking him, you know, what do you make of this? And he said, the parallels are eerie and scary. And I'll read you his quote. I had interviewed him and I reported at that time. He said the anti-Islamic, anti-Muslim outpourings are almost verbatim copies of the diatribes of Joseph Goebbels, the propaganda minister for Hitler. The same rabble-rousing slogans, the same baseless allegations, the same demonization, unquote. This is Uri talking. So this anti-Muslim animus has been dressed up also in the language of secularism, in the language of feminism, in the language of women's liberation, in the language of LGBT rights, all nothing but an animus towards Muslims. And we end up, all words lead to some action in the end. And we have seen what has happened. The man who killed the murderer convicted murderer in Quebec City was Andre Bissonnette. His name was on the rifle of the assailant and the killer in Christchurch, New Zealand, where he gunned down 51 Muslim worshippers in 2 mosques. So they copy each other. So we live in perilous times, and we in Canada especially have a special duty because we are a model to the rest of the world, had been for a long time. And what has happened in London and Quebec City and the Rexdale Mosque are a stain on our collective character and the name of Canada. So it behooves us, all of us, to be aware of this background and not to be fooled by what is happening, tearing us apart and killing people and so on. And even when people are not murdered on a day-to-day basis, the harassment that has gone on of Muslims, especially women, Muslim women, hijabi women, is just shameful. It's absolutely shameful, and it falls to each one of us to see what we can do. And Londoners especially can play a role because, London was a home to, and a pioneering home to a lot of Arab immigrants from Lebanon. It used to be said that London had more Arabs from a certain village in Lebanon than the village itself in Lebanon had. So London has a storied history to live up to, and we in Canada have a special duty to be on guard and to embrace each other and to keep this pluralism and multiculturalism alive as a lesson and as a model to the rest of the world. Thank you.
I want to thank you, Haroon, for so much to say. Maybe I would just say I want to thank you most of all for igniting that challenge to us in London for what we will do going forward. I really, really believe that you're right about that. We are going to address this here, and it's not going to be this event today. It's a commitment we'll take forward. I now have the honor of introducing Dr. Ingrid Matson. Professor Matson is the London and Windsor Chair of Islamic Studies in the Faculty of Theology at Huron University College at Western University. And previous to that, she taught for many years at Hartford Seminary, where she founded the first accredited program in Islamic chaplaincy in North America. Her writings focus on Islamic theological ethics and Quranic studies. In 2018, Dr. Matson founded the research and educational initiative, the HERMA Project, to prevent and respond to violations in trust in Muslim spaces. We are fortunate to have Dr. Matson join us in person at Victoria Hospital today. Please join me in welcoming her.
Thank you so much. It's really a great honor to be here. Haroon gave you such a big picture and overview that I think is really, really important. And my perspective is from a different angle on the ground. I am someone who is really enmeshed within the Muslim community, in the caring professions, and who has felt for the last 20 years almost like Alice through the looking glass, like trying to understand what kind of world I'm in as it gets stranger and stranger and stranger. And I think many of us feel that way these days. It's hard to, we see people talking and it's like we're living in a different reality. And the basis for what is truth, what is factual, how we know each other it seems so distorted. And so what I wanted to do today was bring you through my journey into that strange world and some of the things that I've learned that maybe can help us figure out how we got here today. You know, definitely what Haroon said is the big picture of how we got here. So let me bring it down to the ground level from my perspective. When 9/11 happened, I'm a Canadian, but I'd gone to the United States for graduate school and then was working at a Christian seminary, ecumenical by that time, graduate seminary, and focusing on pastoral care, developing a pastoral care program, training chaplains, putting my chaplaincy students in all different settings, including hospitals. And of course, it was this huge shock, and I felt so disoriented and wanted, really shocked that something I love so much, a faith that I find so life affirming, focused on compassion and care and ethics, could be used in horrendous act. And I was committed to trying to understand how this could happen and countering it and rejecting what had happened as, not in my name and not in the name of my faith. And I found tremendous solidarity with colleagues from other faith traditions. This horrible event actually really brought our partnerships to the next level. So we moved from, I think, kind of basic shared projects like where we served together in soup kitchens or planted gardens to really looking much more deeply at our society. So we form partnerships even on the national level to address structural injustices such as lack of access to health care, to address the issue of urban food deserts and a carceral system in America that is just simply pervaded with anti-Black racism. So it was a difficult time, but I felt like, yeah, we were responding in an important way, in a principled way. But over the next couple of years, by about 2003 or 4, things had shifted dramatically. And I started to encounter people who considered me part of the problem. So when I would go to events and, present educational programs, suddenly I was part of the problem because I was Muslim. And I was being told that Islam itself, not a distorted interpretation of it or a cynical instrumentalization of it, was the problem. And I would give a presentation and someone would stand up and say, why should we believe what you are saying about Islam? I said, I mean, I have a PhD from the University of Chicago in this field. I teach at a graduate ecumenical seminary, Islamic studies. I'm endorsed by all the multi-faith partners. But they said, no, we don't believe you. We know what you believe. How do you know what I believe? And they would cite, these people that they found on the internet. They would point me to websites. They would say to me, if you really want to know what's going on, check out this website. Now, I'm sure many of you are familiar with this. This might start to ring some bells if after 2 years through the pandemic, when we've encountered people who believe that the truth about COVID-19, about vaccines, about masking is not found with, infectious disease specialists or, physicians or with public health officials, but on some website on the internet. So I feel like this was the start of this new age that we're living in, where there's a real problem of epistemology. I mean, how do we know what we know? I almost feel sometimes like what our community went through was a kind of beta test for that. Because after that, this same very effective method of, hacking the algorithms, the social media and website algorithms, the search engines, having all of these interlinked networks of websites, having bots really, amplify certain messages, brought us in a world where we don't know. Like, we are not living in the same world of truth and knowledge. And what people will do very naturally, and what we all did when Google was invented, we were all like, wow, this is a great source of information. Now I can just put in the search engine and I can find so much information and news. And of course it's still there, but the problem is that it went from something that it never was neutral, but it seemed to be sort of, offer the possibility for knowledge to actually becoming a source of disinformation. And people who actually want to know something in a sincere way will immediately go and search for information on an issue, and they're led down this rabbit hole of more and more and more disinformation, and also anger, hatred, and extremism. And all of those things, I learned it. I learned it just experientially, but I also sought out experts, and we worked, with organizations and visited Facebook and all of these organizations and had discussions, and we understood what was going on. By 2010, we understood very well what was going on, and they did as well. Unfortunately, whatever was done was not serious enough. Whatever was done was not as important as making profits or whatever the reasons are behind it. And the same kind of sources that used the technology, but also used the cognitive weaknesses of human beings, work together to create disinformation and division in society. So I remember, my degree is in, classical Islamic theology and ethics. So all of these things were things I had to learn. I had to learn because it was affecting my world and my community. And so I dug deeper into things like the anchoring effect, and understood how our mind prioritizes, necessarily for survival, fear-based images and risks to our safety over the things that are positive or good or life-affirming. And understanding how, if you meld the technology of the internet and the algorithms with these weaknesses we have, these cognitive biases we have, it's just a perfect, recipe for distorting our perceptions in the world. And so over time, we've all seen that the kind of that violence in society has increased. We see that anti-Black racism, which has always existed, has been amplified to a point that it is, it's really frightening to see the kind of incidents that have happened and the open, hostile, racist language that is being used in justifications. It's very easy to find anyone who wants to search for these. The anti-immigrant movements, the white supremacy movement in general, the incel movement. For God's sakes, who would ever have thought? Misogyny has existed for so long, but there's actually a movement of people, of young men primarily, gathered around this idea that they hate women because women are refusing their advances. And this is what happened in Toronto. Same thing, where a vehicle was used as a weapon of mass murder. So I see all of these things interconnected. I see that, unfortunately, our responses have been weak. That we focused on the personal, on personal interactions, on whether each one of us as an individual has prejudices or has biases, and that we should be good people and that we should interrupt. And all of those things are true. We should do those, we should understand ourselves. We should interrupt incidents of bias and racism, but frankly, it's not enough. After the Christchurch massacre, which Haroon mentioned, and I had many friends in New Zealand and who were there and, experienced that and experienced what happened later. There was a meeting, there was a conference and an initiative, and our Prime Minister of Canada and the Prime Minister of New Zealand was there, and the France, other countries, they got together and agreed on this document called the Christchurch Call. And the Christchurch Call is a commitment by governments and by internet or social media organizations to eliminate terrorist and violent extremist content online. They had this meeting. Frankly, I have, my friends who are trying to implement this, even in New Zealand, say that after that big announcement was made, very little was done. And that daily they are monitoring the hate and the extremism that's online, and it still is not being addressed. It simply is not being addressed. And again, I think all of you are able to know that when it comes to violence or hostility against medical workers, healthcare workers, public health officials, etc., we see that, again, these things are dealt with in a really superficial way, and the commitment just simply isn't there. So we need to do more. It takes so long. It takes so much effort and resources and time to grow a person. You think about the hope when someone is going to have a child, when a family wants to have a child, and the care they put into even, the prenatal care, and then all of the sleepless nights and hours when that baby is so young, and then all of society comes together and offers education and wellness visits and all of the things that go to make a person. We think about this beautiful family that was lost, that was taken, and all of those people who put so much love and care and attention to their education and their health and raising and outlook, and then it can be taken away so easily. Hate is a fire that just burns everything. You build something, there it is, and now it's just burned down. So, but we believe, I want to say that as a person of faith, we believe that nothing is ever totally lost, and that all of their good deeds and their good works and their examples continue, and in fact, they're amplified. As we turn our attention to what they did, in fact, the effect of their goodness is more and more. So what's left for us? And I just want to close with a few remarks that when it comes to action, I just really want to prioritize how important understanding the technical challenge is. We're not going to get out of this unless we understand what is happening online through social media, and the fact that people continue to go to these sources for their information. And so if we do not, from a very, very early age, provide good, better information, truthful information, but also education about these sources, and if we don't monitor them to some extent, free speech, yes, but we all have responsibility. We all have free speech, but we have responsibility for the consequences of our speech. It's not easy, but we really need to address, all of us need to address this, because everyone's child at home is Googling something and getting a whole lot of misinformation, whether it's about Islam or about other things. Second, each one of us, of course, needs to continue to reflect within our own selves. And this is very hard. I mean, we know that none of us can be free of biases, but we need to understand how our mind works. And the first time I ever had bias training was in a job, was when I got a job and it was required to have anti-bias training. I don't know, maybe these days children get it younger, but we can't wait until we're, whatever age, to have anti-bias training. It just needs to be part of our environment. So that we start changing our responses a little bit or being aware of our responses. Third, we need to look at, of course, the big picture, but also where we are. Mayor Holder talked about the, London Health Sciences as being the biggest employer in London. Wow, there's so much that can be done then from a structural level. We think about how vulnerable people are when they seek care, and how vulnerable families are when they're hoping for that care and for understanding and needing maybe something a little different, maybe needing some accommodation that others don't quite understand. So to really look within your own system, how can you address, how can you first even know? Do you have the evidence? Is there research on what is happening? I haven't seen much research about Islamophobia in healthcare settings in Canada. I haven't seen it. I know of some studies in the United States, but first we need information, and then we need to talk about, what are the experiences of people and how do we respond and how do we change the way we deal with things. We need to, we need to remember, it's amazing, this is very salient right now, what happened in London. But when you look at the example of what happened after the Quebec City massacre, if you can remember how shocked you were and politicians came and everything, and then what happened afterwards. I know the families of the men that were killed. And I have, my friend is one of the care workers who continues to support those families. Those widows face Islamophobia every day in Quebec. Every day. And it was after that massacre that Bill 21 banning the wearing of a headscarf, in certain professions, which means, you're not banning the thing, you're banning the people. So those people were banned, including some of those women are banned from positions in that province that pledged to take care of them. So we forget very quickly. And the reality is the deep emotion that we have about this will pass, will fade. But that doesn't mean that we've dealt with the situation. So we have work to do, but I do have confidence that we can address these things with some struggle, and also understanding that all of our struggles against racism and bias and discrimination really are connected. It's the same kind of, each one has its own particular, aspects or specificities, but they're all connected in terms of how human beings interact with our world. So I believe we can do better. Thank you.
Thanks, everybody. And thank you, Dr. Matson. That was incredibly thought-provoking, and so were your remarks, Ray. I think as a professional communicator, I think our vantage point at the front lines of disinformation really hit home hearing what you had to say. We have been rather loose in timekeeping. I apologize to folks for that. We do have time for very few questions. So I just wanted to ask Dr. Matson and Haroon, this is a stopping point or a waypoint on our journey here at LHSC to combat Islamophobia. Would you be able to offer any direction on where we might look for additional resources, given that wave of disinformation that you spoke about? Haroon, could you speak to that first?
In Dr. Matson, you have a great resource. She lives in your community. Just keep calling on her. She's a very modest person. What you're looking at is an extraordinarily distinguished Canadian. She was the first woman president of the largest Muslim organization in North America and in the world, Islamic Society of North America. And she's a very thoughtful person. And you can see she's a very sincere person. So you in your community have a great resource. Keep bothering her. That's what I'm saying. And she will, and we will all help you if you want to do seminars and things like that. In terms of education, I'm sure she would be available. I'm available. We will find you other people. There is no shortage of talent in this country, Muslim and non-Muslim both. People of goodwill.
Yeah, so I mean, yes, of course, we are a resource at the university. I'm personally a resource. We also have other organizations that are doing research in Canada, and I can help provide a list. There's also, I happen to have been asked to be on the selection committee for a new postdoctoral fellowship in Islamophobia in healthcare education, that it's the first year. It was just established at the University of Toronto. So I'm really looking forward to that researcher once we select the postgraduate fellow who will be there doing research specifically on this topic. And I do think that as a combination of, of a healthcare center that includes educational institutions, we do need research. We need researchers to really find out what's happening and to talk about find solutions. So I do think that that's something that would be possible also within the system.
Thanks so much, both of you. As I said, we are running out of time. So I want to assure folks who have submitted a question through WebEx that we will capture those questions and we'll do our very best to find a way to respond to you. I just have one last question to actually pose to our CEO, Dr. Jackie Schleifer-Taylor, before she goes into her closing remarks, and that's to ask essentially what's next for LHSC as we look to build a cohesive response to Islamophobia here in our worlds.
Thank you for this final question, and I find it difficult to find words to close an event of this nature. So I'm just going to say that I want to once again acknowledge the Afzal family, and I'm going to take you up on the challenge, Dr. Matson. We're not going to forget. We're not going to make this our action. This is the beginning. I want to thank you for coming today and thank everybody for their commitment on behalf of LHSC.
And that actually brings our CEO Grand Rounds to a conclusion today. I thank everybody for joining here in person and virtually, and a great debt of gratitude to our speakers today. Thanks so much.